Thank you, Bobby. Effort and results. Question for you guys. How many of you, when you get an evaluation for Toastmasters, focus more on the negative? I do. Do any of you focus on the positive? Like, you had really good eye contact. Yeah, I did. Does anybody else focus on that? Not so much. You're more focused on what can I improve. For me, I'm a person who believes in continual improvement. So, as we move through our theme this evening, I'm going to ask you for some advice, because this is interactive. I'm last minute, you guys get to join in and get this too. So, help me figure out how to not focus on the negative, focus more on the positive. Think about that. I'll be asking some more questions here in a little bit. But tonight, we'll move into the coup de grace with someone who is not a nascent speaker. Is there a limit to how fast anything can go? And if so, what is that limit? Those are the questions that Lloyd will answer in his speech this evening. He'll be finishing level 1 of the presentation mastery path with the researching and presenting project. Lloyd Smith and Faster Than a Bat.
When the first caveman who was carving a wheel out of rock was working, his neighbor probably came over from the adjoining cave, looked at it for a while and said, "Well, how fast can that thing go?" That's a question that people have been asking since that moment. How fast will it go? That raises the question of, is there a limit to how fast something can go, some human-made object can go? I don't know about that, but there is definitely a world speed record, and it is 157,000 miles per hour. It's held by the Helios B satellite that was launched in 1976 to the sun to study the solar processes, how the energy is generated by the sun. As it was drawn in toward the sun by the sun's enormous gravity, it accelerated up to that 157,000 miles an hour. See, it's actually easy to find that speed record. The NASA site has a little article about it. Pretty interesting stuff, too. But that's the official speed record. The question is, has anything ever gone faster than that? And to get an answer to that, we have to look back to 1957 and something called Operation Plum Bomb. That was a series of 29 nuclear tests, 28 of which were conducted in the atmosphere. Nobody cared about that back then. They were done in the Nevada desert, about 75 miles northwest of Las Vegas. And the people in Las Vegas could see the mushroom clouds whenever one of those tests happened. Everybody would gather and go, ooh, ah. Many of those people are not going ooh, ah anymore because of the radiation from those tests. But that's a different story. During one of these tests, there were 29 of these tests, and they were designed to test out nuclear warheads, all the way from giant ICBM warheads down to little bitty ones that were supposed to be used as torpedo warheads. Since it's so expensive and complicated to have nuclear weapons tests, the experimenters threw in about 50 different side experiments designed to analyze how well structures held up, how well clothing could deal with nuclear radiation. Not well is the answer to that one, by the way. And many other questions, too. The weirdest one of those was during a test that the Air Force conducted of a missile called a Genie missile. That was an anti-aircraft missile with a nuclear warhead. It turns out there are some difficulties dealing with that if you're in the other airplane, the one that shoots the missile. But the Air Force decided, wow, wouldn't it be cool to do a publicity stunt at the same time? And so when that missile was fired as part of the test over Yucca Flats, Nevada, there were 5 Air Force officers and a photographer standing right below where the blast went off. The idea was to find out whether or not you could use nuclear weapons around human populations without harming them. It turned out it didn't harm them, but they did not enjoy the experience of standing just 15,000 feet below a light twice as bright as the sun. Now, one of these tests was called the Pascal shot, and this is the one I want to focus on. It was one of the first underground nuclear tests that was conducted. Basically, in an underground nuclear test, they drill a well. In this case, it was about 2.5 feet in diameter. It sank about 700 feet down. It was lined with a steel casing, like lots of wells are. They lowered the warhead into the shaft, the warhead they were testing into the shaft, and then some instruments to measure the yield and so on. Then they put a giant steel cap, actually a huge manhole cover, weighed 2,000 pounds on top of that shaft. And that's when it occurred to the lead experimenter, Dr. Robert Brownlee, to wonder what was going to happen to that cap when a nuclear explosion happened 700 feet below it. As it turns out, they were inventing the world's first, and so far only, nuclear potato gun. Dr. Brownlee was curious enough about that cap that he had an ultra-high-speed camera focused on it so he could see what happened to the lid when the nuclear blast went off. The camera was an extremely high-speed camera, and the lid was captured in just 2 frames. In one of them, it's still sitting on top of the shaft, and the second one is about a ½ inch above the shaft, and then it's not in any of the other pictures. Now, since the speed of the camera was known, it was easy to use simple arithmetic to calculate that the cap left the frame at 170,000 miles per hour. That's about 50 miles per second, if you worked it out. That's moving right along. The interesting thing about that is that there's something called the orbital escape velocity from the Earth. And that's the velocity that a projectile has to be moving to escape from the Earth. For example, when they fired the missile, or the Apollo moon missions, they had to exceed that velocity to get them away from the Earth. That's about 25,000 miles per hour. So this cap was moving at about, what, 8 times the escape velocity from the Earth. In fact, there's an escape velocity from the entire solar system of only 26 miles per second. So that thing was moving along at double the escape velocity. The question is then, what happened to the cap? It was never found anywhere within hundreds of miles of the test site. So did the Americans inadvertently launch a giant manhole cover into interstellar space in 1957? That's a possibility. The thing might have been flipped off the potato gun. Now, Dr. Brownlee, in his article about this, says that that's probably not what happened. And that's due to something that Isaac Newton found out in 1630 when he devised his impactor limit principle. What it amounts to is any kind of an impactor, an artillery shell, a fist, a giant manhole cover, whatever, gets accelerated to the point when it has to push a mass equal to its own mass. In this case, that manhole cover was pushing a column of air. And air can compress, but to a certain limit. And when that cover was going at ultra high speed, what happened was that it got to the point where the air could not move out of the way fast enough, couldn't compress anymore. And so the manhole cover, the atoms in the steel, or the molecules in the steel of the manhole cover were almost certainly shredded into their constituent atoms. The thing just literally vanished into the air, in other words, using air. You can experiment in a similar way if you're driving along in your car. Stick your hand out the window. When you're doing about 10 miles an hour, you can feel the breeze all right, but it's no big deal. But accelerate up to, say, 80 or 90 miles an hour and stick your hand out, and you will find out what it's like to push a column of air the size of your hand. At a certain point, your arm would get torn off because the air can't compress. I don't recommend that you go to that limit, but it could happen. So sadly, there is not a giant manhole cover traveling through interstellar space at 170,000 miles an hour. I kind of wish there were. Can you imagine an alien civilization finding that thing, and that would be their first encounter with human beings? Oh, our evaluation sheets.